But yeah, so I'm Laura Helsby. This is the third and final study of my PhD that I'm presenting today. So the kind of focus of my PhD was exploring the play experience of people with persistent low mood. Essentially, persistent low mood is a symptom of depression. It's kind of the defining symptom of depression. And the main reason that I use that term is so that my participants don't have to have kind of an official diagnosis of depression, because that can be quite hard to get. And I found that participants kind of identified with that term a little bit more than when I use the word depression. So you can ask me about that in more detail if you're interested. But the purpose of this study that I'm presenting today was that it was a diary study. And I wanted to kind of explore how games affected mood of people with persistent low mood in the moment. So I was kind of looking at a couple of things. I was looking at what kind of makes someone with low mood play a game. How does someone feel before and after they play? And I had this aspect of looking at motivations as well. So does the reason that someone's playing impact the kind of mood benefits or detriments that they get out of that experience? So the kind of structure of the study, I wanted to kind of capture naturalistic play. That was quite important to me. So I got participants to kind of fill out this diary for 9 days. It had to include 1 weekend, was the only real requirement. Other than that, they got to decide whenever that 9-day period was. I interviewed them beforehand just to kind of explain the study, get a kind of idea of how they felt about games generally, what they typically played, how they typically played, make sure they kind of understood everything. And then I also interviewed them afterwards to find out how they found the experience of keeping diaries. So that was something I was quite interested in, because there's a lot of diary studies and not a lot about how they actually function. So I kind of added some questions to kind of investigate that. I had 14 participants in total. That's kind of some demographics of them. This is qualitative work for context, in case you haven't realized. So they kind of filled out these diaries. I'll show you them now. This is what the kind of format was. It was really important to me that I kept it as easy to fill in as possible. Obviously, I'm dealing with people with persistent low mood. There are kind of complications with motivation and people kind of having energy to keep a diary. So I tried to streamline it as much as possible. So before they played, I just kind of asked roughly when they were playing, what they were about to play, how they were currently feeling, and why they decided to play that. So I intentionally kept the how are you currently feeling very open. I didn't talk about mood specifically with them. I kind of wanted to see what words they would use, and kind of that was part of the interest for me. And then afterwards, I asked kind of roughly how long did they play for? Again, how are you currently feeling now you finished playing? What was the most significant thing that happened during play? And the purpose of this question was so that when I had the interviews with them afterwards, they would remember the play sessions. So part of the interviews was also to clarify anything that was ambiguous in the diary. Obviously, people are writing things, I'm interpreting them. And this would kind of help with those discussions, right? And then they were also just able to write anything else they felt. Quite a lot of participants did use this box. A lot of them left kind of little funny notes or comments on their play, which was really nice to read. There was a lot of like reflective stuff in that box as well. So now we have some data. So there are 161 diary entries across all 14 of the participants. From those diary entries, there are 165 different games. Some participants recorded multiple games in the same diary entry. I guess they were playing 2 games at once, or they played 1 game for 5 minutes and then swapped to another game, So already you can see how that's kind of an interesting thing in terms of methodology, that people may play multiple games at the same time, and I hadn't accounted for that. In terms of categorizing games, this is something I've struggled with throughout my PhD, because genre isn't real. For previous studies, I asked participants, but that wasn't really practical for the diary. I felt it would add too much to the participant load to ask them to define every single game they played. So I just let Google do it. This probably wouldn't work anymore, but I Googled every game that was mentioned, and I just took the words that were presented here, and I used that to categorize them. This is a graph of the data here. So This shows that the kind of most common game type played during the 9 days by the participants was RPG. There's a count of 34 there. That's not necessarily very surprising because RPG is also kind of the most general term typically. A lot of different games get kind of categorized as RPGs, so that's worth bearing in mind when you're looking at this. Simulation games are the next with 23, and then there's kind of puzzle, racer, roguelike, kind of all this, a bunch of different types in the middle. And then the ones near the end of the graph tend to actually be the same game. I kept the categorization consistent, but it's just to kind of give you an idea of what people were playing. So in terms of the actual meat of the research questions, the actual analysis, I used qualitative content analysis, which is kind of a system, if you're not familiar with it, where you're building categories of things. So I had 2 main focuses. I had moods and I had motivations. In terms of the diaries and what people filled out, the mood codes came from these questions. So how are you currently feeling before? How are you currently feeling after? What was the most significant thing that happened during the session? Because people would talk about how they felt during that box. And also in the notes bit, people would also still talk about how they felt there. And then in terms of motivations, how are you currently feeling before? Sometimes people would talk about motivations in those boxes as well, because people are people. They're not going to fill things out perfectly. And then obviously, why did you decide to play this game now? So again, my approach with this was very open. I wanted to use what participants said. I didn't want to kind of impose anything. And then there was several phases of this. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about this in this talk. But again, if you want to talk to me afterwards about this, you are welcome to. In terms of results, so with the motivation coding, I did 2 different things. Firstly, I coded individual motivations. So there could be, in response to the question, why are you playing this game, someone might have written multiple things. So I coded each of those kind of individually. So that's what I'm presenting here. So there were 54 different individual motivations reported by participants with persistent low mood. The top 5 were they'd played it before and they wanted to play it again. Playing for social reasons. Playing while they were doing something else. So this would be something like, I'm watching TV and it's easy to play this while I'm watching TV. To relax, something being easy to play. So again, just kind of generically, this is easy. I don't have to do anything to engage with it. And you can see that is also in the easy or simple to play code. I then took these individual motivations and I tried to group them. I did this by grouping the individual motivations and then returning back to the diary entries with my groups to check that the groups still captured the data. They did, which was great. So in terms of the groups of motivations, the most common group for motivations for persistent low mood players was low effort or convenience. That's got a count of 32 there. Then there's kind of achievement, enjoyment, social. They've got counts of 26, 25. Mood management, novelty, curiosity, passing time, habit, and then avoiding work. Avoiding work all came from one participant, not to call that participant out, but that was the case. Just worth mentioning, and I'll kind of go into that in the discussion a little bit as well. But you can see here that the kind of most common motivation was low effort and convenience. I've got some example quotes. I won't go through all of these here, but this is just to kind of give you an idea of what this data might look like, because it is qualitative data and it's kind of interesting to look at. So for example, for the low effort convenience motivation, I was actually going to boot up Stray, but then the controller was too far and I'm already in bed, so I'm playing my Switch instead. That's kind of an example of what that code might look like. There's some other kind of things, the social things like spending time with my wife. The primary thing there, people might be playing socially, but that didn't necessarily mean they were motivated socially unless they kind of explicitly stated that. So that's kind of the motivations aspect. We will return to that in a moment. How does someone with persistent low mood feel before and after playing a game? So again, this is going through and kind of coding individual feelings. There was no kind of grouping for this aspect. Before they played, there were 57 different feelings and 328 instances of those feelings. This is just to give you an idea of what a nightmare this was to code and organize. The majority of those feelings were negative. So you can see that's 212 out of 328 were negative. So mostly people were feeling bad before they played. The most common negative feelings were low mood, unsurprisingly, perhaps, feeling tired and anxious. I also want to say here, because I've had some questions about tiredness, I had another code that was sleepy, that was kind of a more neutral state of tiredness. So this is specifically being tired in a way that is negative. So I'm so exhausted, I can't do anything, that kind of thing. After play, we've got 377 instances of 67 different feelings. There were kind of different feelings there. 139 of those were positive and 128 were neutral. So what this is saying is that after play, people weren't really feeling bad anymore. They were either feeling good or they were feeling neutral. And the most common positive feelings were just generically good and accomplished. And the most common neutral were there was no change and that they were feeling okay. However, this wasn't really enough on its own to answer the research question. I coded all of the feelings, all of the entries before and all of the entries after by their overall sentiment. So were they feeling good, were they feeling neutral, or were they feeling bad? And then I compared how they felt before to how they felt after. So I had this kind of list of mood changes. So rather than focusing on specific feelings reported, the overall sentiment of that diary entry. And that shows that with this graph, out of the diary entries, which I think is the 161, yes, 161, in 75 of those, there was a positive mood change. So people went from feeling either bad or neutral to feeling good. In 65 of them, there was no change. So either they felt bad before, they still felt bad. They felt neutral before, they still felt neutral. They felt good and they were still feeling good. And in only 18 of those was there a negative mood change. So in summary, gaming didn't seem to really make people feel feel worse, sorry. How am I doing for time? Okay, yeah, I'll kind of go briefly through this. So I was then interested if playing for different motivations resulted in different kinds of successful mood changes. So if you're assuming that people are playing to not feel worse, which is maybe a little bit of an assumption, I won't go into how I coded this because I'm a little short on time, but I want to highlight some things. So low effort and achievement were kind of the top motivations, right, from the groups. Playing for low effort did not result in any negative mood changes. So if they played for low effort, they never felt worse afterwards, at least in my study. Playing for achievement also had a relatively low rate of making people feel worse. So there's only 3 there in that table. Interestingly here, playing for social purposes was a lot more mixed. So in the literature, playing socially is generally seen as a good thing for well-being. It usually makes people feel better. It usually boosts mood. In this sample, it wasn't always the case. So there might be unique kind of aspects of energy with social play for people with persistent low mood that isn't being captured by the studies or data focusing on general populations. And then finally, playing for enjoyment and playing for mood management. I've highlighted these because these are people specifically playing to kind of manage their mood or to feel better, to have fun. And you can see for enjoyment, it's not always very successful, right? There's only 11 there, positive mood changes when people are playing to feel good, to have fun. And for mood management, there's kind of a bit more success there. So there was only 1 negative mood change when people were playing to manage their own mood. So the kind of key focus, what does this all mean? In total, there's these kind of categories of motivations for play. The interesting thing about this compared to the general population literature is this low effort convenience group of motivations. That is not typically found. There's things a bit like it in some studies, but that seems to be something that might be unique to the persistent low mood population, or certainly seems to be very important to them. Before playing a game, people were most likely to feel negative. After playing a game, they were most likely to feel either positive or neutral. And positive mood changes or no mood changes were much more common than negative mood changes. So effectively, games might be this kind of low-risk way of boosting mood, certainly compared to other hobbies. This kind of low effort, low risk, assigned to it. Playing for different motivations had different levels of success. The highest success rate for improving mood was playing games for low effort. So again, the most common motivation had the most positive mood changes associated with it. There might be a reason for that. Maybe people are aware of it. Playing for mood management wasn't always successful, but it rarely resulted in a negative mood change again. It just maybe didn't boost mood. And playing for achievement, again, positive, it rarely resulted in a negative mood change, but in terms of positive mood changes, it wasn't necessarily always successful. Some limitations just to point out for contextualizing this data. Because it's a diary study, there's different amounts of information at different points. Some aspects you get a lot of information on, some aspects you don't get a lot of information on. I got a big long list of games and almost no information about those games. That was by design, but it's kind of worth bearing in mind. Individuals could influence the data heavily. So again, I mentioned that avoiding work all came from one participant. Because some people played a lot more than other people, there were elements of that. So if you played more and you played in a certain way, you would obviously have a bigger impact on the qualitative data. And because this is qualitative data, just to kind of iterate to the room, this work kind of represents a detailed understanding of a few participants with persistent low mood. It's not intended to be generalized to a huge population. And I think that is everything. Thank you.